Imagine this, friends. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship that's creaking and groaning under the weight of the open Atlantic, the wind howling like it's got a personal grudge against you. And the sky is so gray it looks like somebody spilled a whole bucket of dirty laundry water over the horizon. The sun barely shows its face. The nights, they stretch on forever, like that one relative who overstays their welcome at a family gathering and just will not leave. And you're not some modern tourist with a GPS and a thermos of hot coffee. You're an ancient Greek guy from Massalia, what we now call Marseille, sailing into waters that most people back home thought were pure fantasy, the edge of the world where sea, air, and land all melt into one big messy soup. That guy was Pytheas, and friends, his story is one of the wildest real-life adventure tales from the ancient world that almost nobody talks about enough. But wait, before we dive all the way into Pytheas, there's another guy we need to talk about first, because history loves a good double feature. Hamilcar of Carthage, a Carthaginian explorer who, centuries earlier, might have already poked his nose into those same northern waters. Two stories, one epic stretch of ocean, and a whole lot of wait, people actually did that, moments. Stick with me, friends, because this is going to flow like a late night chat over drinks where the stories just keep coming, and nobody wants to go home yet. All right, let's start with Hamilcar, because he came first, roughly in the early 5th century BC. Around the same time, his fellow Carthaginian Hanno was busy sailing south down the African coast and seeing things that would make your jaw drop. Carthage was flexing hard back then, controlling trade routes, mining resources, basically running the Western Mediterranean like it was their personal marketplace. And they wanted the good stuff from the north, tin especially, because tin plus copper equals bronze, and bronze was the high-tech material of the day. So they send Hamilcar out from Gads, modern-day Cadiz in Spain, with orders to explore the outer coasts of Europe. 4 months, friends. 4 whole months of sailing north along the Atlantic seaboard. Now picture it. The ship is moving slowly. The sea is weirdly calm in places, like somebody hit the pause button on the waves. Seaweed is everywhere, thick enough that it grabs the prow and holds the ship back like a bad traffic jam on a rainy Monday morning. No strong breezes to push them along. And according to the later Roman writer Avianus, who was quoting from Hamilcar's Lost Periplus, basically an ancient sailing log, there were sea monsters, or at least creatures big enough to scare the crew. Probably whales or big fish, but to those sailors, it must have felt like the ocean itself was trying to swallow them. Hamilcar reported that the voyage to the Eastromnides, likely the area around Brittany in modern France, took that full 4 months, and the conditions were so sluggish and tangled that it was almost impossible to make progress. Was he exaggerating a bit? Almost certainly. Carthaginians weren't exactly known for sharing trade secrets with the competition. Greek sailors were always sniffing around for the tin routes, so painting the northern Atlantic as a nightmare of calms, seaweed thickets, and monsters was a smart way to keep rivals away. Yeah, friends, don't bother going up there. The sea just sits there like day-old soup, and the monsters will eat your oars for breakfast. Classic business move. Still, most modern scholars think he really did reach the coasts of northwestern France, and there's a solid chance he pushed farther, maybe even to the British Isles, or at least heard solid reports of Albion and Earn, the old names for Britain and Ireland. The Tin Islands, the Cassiderides, were part of the conversation. Whether he personally stepped ashore in Cornwall or just got close enough to confirm the trade routes is still debated. This part is theory and reconstruction based on fragments. We don't have Himilco's original words, only scraps preserved centuries later by Pliny the Elder and Avienus. So take the exact details with a grain of salt, but the core voyage, pretty much accepted as historical. And here's where I pause for a second, friends, because I can't help thinking about the motivation. If you were Himilco, sitting in Carthage with the Senate, or the merchant families breathing down your neck for more tin and amber, and whatever else the North had, would you risk 4 months of that kind of sailing? The Bay of Biscay is no joke even today. Storms can come out of nowhere. Currents are tricky. And you're doing it in a ship that would look like a bathtub next to a modern freighter. I honestly wonder if the glory and the trade monopoly were worth the constant fear that one bad wave could end the whole expedition. If it was you, would you sign up for that mission? Or would you suddenly develop a convenient illness and stay home polishing the bronze statues? Something to chew on. While we keep going. Anyway, Himilco's report, whatever the truth of the monsters and the endless seaweed, helped lock in Carthaginian knowledge of the Atlantic routes for a while. Then time passes. A century and a half later, give or take, another explorer steps onto the stage, and this one is Greek, from Massalia, and somehow even more ambitious. Enter Pytheas. Massalia was a bustling Greek colony on the southern coast of Gaul, a real trading powerhouse with ships going in and out, ideas flowing, and a healthy curiosity about the wider world. Pytheas wasn't just some random sailor. The guy was a navigator, a geographer, an astronomer. He knew how to use a sundial, how to measure the height of the sun, how to track the length of the day as he moved north. Around 325 BC, right in the era of Alexander the Great, though Pytheas was off doing his own thing far from the Persian campaigns, he sets out. Some say he sailed from Massalia through the Pillars of Hercules, past Gads, and up the coasts of Spain and Gaul. Others think the Carthaginians still controlled the Strait of Gibraltar tightly enough that he might have gone overland across Gaul to the Atlantic coast and then hopped on local ships. Either way, he reaches Brittany, crosses to Beleriand, Land's End in Cornwall, and starts exploring Britain proper. Friends, this is where it gets properly wild. Pytheas is the first Mediterranean writer we know of who describes Britain as an island. He calls it Bretonnic or Bretonnic. He says it's triangular with 3 corners, Cantian Kent, Beleriand Cornwall, and the Orcas the Orkneys. He estimates the circumference at about 40,000 stadia, roughly 4,000 miles. And while the number is a bit high, the proportions of the sides are surprisingly good. He visits the tin mines. He watches how the locals dig the ore, process it, and transport it to an island called Ichthys that you can walk to at low tide. He talks about their boats made of wicker and covered with hides. He notes their drinks made from grain and honey. He even claims to have traveled a good portion of the island on foot. Imagine that, walking around rainy, misty Britain in the 4th century BC, talking to the locals through whatever interpreters he could find, measuring the sun with his instruments, watching the days get longer and longer as he heads north. And the nights, oh, the nights. He records how the daylight stretches. In the southern parts of Britain, the longest day is something manageable, but farther north it becomes 18 hours, 19 hours. The locals show him where the sun goes to rest. It dips below the horizon for just a couple of hours and then pops right back up. For a Greek used to the Mediterranean rhythm of day and night, this must have felt like the universe was glitching. Pytheas is the first person from the Mediterranean world to write about these extreme northern daylight conditions in a way that later astronomers could use. Then he pushes even farther. 6 days sail north of Britain he reaches Thule. Ultima Thule, the farthest land. What was Thule? This is pure theory territory. Friends and scholars still argue about it. Some say Iceland. Some say the western coast of Norway. Some even float the Shetlands or Orkneys, but the 6-day sail and the description of the sun's behavior point farther north. Pytheas says that near Thule the summer tropic is the same as the Arctic Circle. The nights are tiny, and beyond that, a frozen sea. A place where land, sea, and air are all mixed together into something like a sea lung, gelatinous, impassable, neither solid nor liquid. He claims to have seen that substance himself. Whether he literally stood on the edge of the pack ice or got the description from locals is another open question. But the idea of Thule entered the geographic imagination and never left. Later writers, from Virgil to medieval mapmakers, kept the name alive as the ultimate northern limit. Pytheas also seems to have gathered information about the Baltic region, Amber, the Guttons, an island called a ballast where amber washed ashore. He may have sailed east along the continental coast or at least collected solid reports. And here's a detail I love. He was one of the first to suggest that the tides are connected to the moon. Not just the sea goes in and out, but an actual causal link. For an ancient observer with no telescopes and no physics textbooks, that's sharp. Now, not everybody believed him. Polybius and Strabo, writing later, basically called him a liar. This guy claims he walked all over Britain and sailed to the ends of the earth. Impossible. He's making it up. Part of it was class prejudice. Pytheas wasn't from the elite circles those later writers preferred. Part of it was that the North was still poorly known, so the extreme descriptions sounded like fairy tales. But modern scholars have mostly rehabilitated him. His measurements of latitude, his day-length observations, his description of Britain's shape, all of it holds up better than the critics expected. The book he wrote, On the Ocean, is lost, but fragments survive in enough places that we can reconstruct a solid outline of the voyage. All right, friends, time for another little pause because I keep coming back to the same question. What drives a person to keep sailing when the nights are getting shorter and shorter, the air is colder, the sea is turning strange, and every rational voice in your head is saying turn around? For Hamilco, it was trade and empire. For Pytheas, it feels more like pure curiosity mixed with scientific ambition. He wasn't just looking for tin, he was measuring the world. He was testing how far the inhabited Earth really stretched. If you were on that ship with him, watching the sun barely dip below the horizon and then rise again almost immediately, would you feel awe or terror? Would you be taking notes like Pytheas, or would you be quietly praying to every god you knew to get you home in one? Peace, I think about that a lot. The line between explorer and madman is thinner than we like to admit. So let's put the two stories side by side for a moment. Hamilco, the Carthaginian, early 5th century, practical, commercial, possibly a bit of a propagandist with the seaweed and the monsters. He opens the northern Atlantic for Carthaginian knowledge and trade. Then, a century and a half later, Pytheas, the Greek scientist sailor, takes the same general direction and turns it into a full geographic and astronomical survey. One is about securing resources. The other is about understanding the edges of the known world. Together, they show that the Mediterranean cultures were not content to stay in their warm, sunny basin. They kept pushing outward, even when the conditions were brutal and the rewards were uncertain. And the uncertainty is real. We don't have complete original accounts for either man. Everything is filtered through later writers who had their own agendas. Did Hamilco reach Britain? Possible, not proven. Did Pytheas actually land on Thule, Or did he just sail close and collect stories? Still debated. Was the sea lung pack ice, or a description of some other northern phenomenon like fog and floating ice mixed with seaweed? We can only guess. When the sources are this fragmentary, honesty requires us to say it straight. A lot of this remains theory. The broad strokes, voyages north, observations of extreme day lengths, contact with tin-producing regions, are solid. The fine details are where the arguments live. Yet even with the gaps, the impact is huge. Pytheas gave the Mediterranean world its first real description of Britain. He introduced Thule. He connected the moon to the tides. Himilco helped map the commercial possibilities of the Atlantic coast. Later explorers, mapmakers, and even poets kept returning to these names. Ultima Thule became a poetic shorthand for the farthest place you could imagine. Britain stopped being a vague rumor and became a triangular island with real corners and real people living rainy, agricultural lives under skies that barely got dark in summer. I keep thinking about the practical side too. The ships, no compasses, no accurate charts, navigation by the stars, by the sun, by the feel of the currents and the color of the water, food that had to last, crews that had to stay motivated through weeks of gray weather and strange horizons. The psychological weight of knowing that if something went wrong, there was no rescue ship, no radio, no chance of a quick return. And yet they went, again and again. Friends, when you look at modern explorers with their satellite phones and heated tents, it's easy to forget how thin the margin was for these ancient guys. One bad storm in the Bay of Biscay, one navigational error in the fog off Scotland, one outbreak of disease on board, and the whole expedition disappears from history without a trace. The fact that we still have any record at all is almost as remarkable as the voyages themselves. And the humor of it in a dark way. Imagine Pytheas trying to explain to the people back in Massalia what he saw. So friends, up there the sun only goes to bed for 2 hours, the sea turns into this weird jelly, and the locals thresh their grain indoors because it never stops raining. You can practically hear the skeptical laughter in the Agra. Sure, Pytheas, and I suppose the fish sing songs and the trees walk around at night. Yet the measurements checked out. The day lengths matched the latitudes. The critics were the ones who ended up looking foolish in the long run. Same with Himilco's seaweed thickets and sea monsters. Easy to mock from a safe harbor in the Mediterranean. Harder when you're the one whose ship is stuck in the sargasso-like mats of Atlantic weed, with something large and dark moving under the surface. Whether those descriptions were pure exaggeration or half-truths, based on real encounters with whales and calm zones, they stuck in the record for a reason. So here we are, more than 2,000 years later, still talking about two men who sailed into the unknown with wooden ships and incomplete maps. Himilco opening the commercial door. Pytheas walking through it with measuring instruments and an open mind. One practical, one scientific. Both brave in ways that are hard to fully grasp from the comfort of a modern screen. I don't know about you, but stories like this make me look at the map differently. Those northern coasts that seem so familiar now, Cornwall, Brittany, the Orkneys, Iceland, were once the absolute frontier. The people who lived there had their own lives, their own knowledge, their own ways of dealing with the long nights and the short growing seasons. And then these Mediterranean outsiders show up, take notes, trade for tin, measure the sun, and sail home to tell the tale. The meeting of worlds, the exchange of goods and information, the permanent expansion of what the world meant. If there's a lesson in all this, maybe it's that curiosity and commerce have always pushed people past the comfortable edges. Sometimes the push comes from the desire for profit. Sometimes it comes from the desire to know. Often it's both at once. And the people who answer that push leave traces that last far longer than they could ever have imagined. All right, friends, I've talked your ear off long enough. These two explorers, Himilco the Carthaginian with his 4-month slog through the weedy, calm Atlantic, and Pytheas the Massaliote with his scientific survey of Britain and the mysterious Thule, deserve more attention than they usually get. The next time you see a map of Northern Europe, or watch the midnight sun in a nature documentary, or just feel the tide come in and remember that somebody 2,000 years ago already connected it to the moon, tip your hat to these guys. They went first, or at least first among the ones who wrote things down. There is a stone that burns. Not like coal, not like wood. It catches fire with a clean, golden flame and gives off a scent older than any temple still standing. The Greeks called it electron. The Romans called it succinum. In the forests of the north, where the Baltic wind cuts through pine and birch, the people who first found it simply called it the sunstone. Amber. For thousands of years before the first Roman legion crossed the Alps, before the first Greek trader wrote of distant seas, this strange resin was already moving. It left the cold shores of what is now Poland, Lithuania, and the Russian coast and traveled south, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until it reached the warm markets of the Mediterranean. Along the way, it passed through the hands of people who never saw the sea that produced it, and it arrived in the hands of people who never saw the forests that grew it. This is the story of the Amber Road. Not a single paved highway with milestones and inns, but a living network of rivers, mountain passes, forest tracks, and human trust that linked the edge of the known world to its center long before Rome rose. It is a story of distance overcome by desire, of a substance so strange that it was buried with kings, offered to gods, and worn by the living as proof that the far north was not empty. And it begins with a tree that died 20 million years ago. Somewhere in the Eocene forests that once covered northern Europe, resin bled from wounded trees. Insects, seeds, feathers, even small lizards became trapped in the slow golden flow. The resin hardened. The forest sank. Ice ages came and went. The Baltic Sea took shape. And then, one day, a piece of that ancient resin washed up on a beach where a human being could find it. The people of the north noticed 3 things almost at once. Amber floated. It could be carved. And when rubbed with wool or fur, it attracted light objects. The first human encounter with static electricity, though they had no name for it. More importantly, it was beautiful. In a world of stone tools and animal hides, a translucent stone the color of honey or blood was a miracle. By the late Neolithic, amber was already traveling. Beads and pendants appear in graves far from the Baltic. But the true road, the sustained, long-distance movement that would eventually reach the Mediterranean, took shape in the Bronze Age and flourished in the centuries before Rome. Picture the journey. A piece of raw amber is gathered on the Samland Peninsula or the shores of the Gulf of Gdansk. It is sorted by color and clarity. The best pieces are set aside for distant trade. Then the movement begins. Some amber travels by water. The Vistula River becomes a highway. From its mouth, dugout canoes and later plank boats push upstream. At certain points, the cargo is unloaded and carried overland to the next river system, the Oder, the Elbe, the Danube. Other routes run farther east, through the Pripyat marshes and down toward the Black Sea. Still others cut southwest through Bohemia and Moravia, following the valleys that will one day carry the amber road of Roman maps. Every stage requires people. Forest dwellers who know which tracks stay dry in spring. River pilots who can read the current. Mountain communities who control the passes and demand payment in amber, bronze, or salt. Middlemen who never travel more than a few days from home, yet form the links in a chain hundreds of kilometers long. The amber itself changes as it moves. Raw nodules become polished beads. Large pieces are carved into animal figures or abstract shapes. Some are drilled and strung. By the time a single piece reaches the Adriatic or the Aegean, it may have passed through a dozen languages and as many sets of hands. What did the northern peoples receive in return? Bronze, tin, copper, later iron, glass beads from the south, wine in amphorae, fabrics, salt, knowledge of metalworking techniques that transformed their own societies. The Amber Road was never a one-way street of luxury goods flowing south. It was an exchange that carried technology, ideas, and status northward, even as the sunstone traveled the other direction. Archaeology makes the traffic visible. In the Bronze Age cemetery at Borum Eshaj in Denmark, amber beads lie beside bronze ornaments of southern style. In the princely graves of Hallstatt culture in Austria, great quantities of amber appear alongside Mediterranean imports. At the Mycenaean shaft graves of Mycenae itself, amber beads rest with gold masks and weapons. The famous amber from the tomb of the Griffin warrior at Pylos, analyzed by modern spectroscopy, carries the chemical signature of Baltic succinate. The connection is not poetic, it is chemical. The Greeks knew the source was distant. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, spoke of a river Eridanus at the edge of the world where amber was said to come from, though he admitted the stories grew vague the farther north one looked. The Romans were more practical. They mapped the route. Pliny, the elder, recorded that a Roman equestrian under Nero was sent north specifically to acquire amber, and returned with so much that the nets used to hold it in the amphitheater were made of the material. The journey, Pliny said, took some 60 days from the Adriatic to the Baltic. 60 days. That is the measure of the road at its most efficient under Roman organization. Before Rome, the same distance might take a season, or a year, or longer if war or weather closed the passes. Yet the road predates Rome by many centuries. It is older than the Roman Empire. It is older than the classical Greek city-states. In the centuries when the Mediterranean was still a patchwork of competing cultures, the Amber Road was already functioning as a continental artery. Consider what that means. While the peoples of the Mediterranean were learning to write in linear scripts and building the first monumental temples, communities in the north were already participating in a trade network that spanned the continent. They did not need to sail the Mediterranean themselves. The road brought the Mediterranean to them and took the north to the Mediterranean. Amber appears in Etruscan tombs. It appears in Celtic Oppida. It appears in the graves of Scythian nomads on the steppe. Each find is a quiet proof that the world was more connected than the later Roman narrative of civilization spreading north likes to admit. The north was already reaching south. The substance itself carried meanings that changed with every culture that touched it. To the northern peoples, it was a gift of the sea and the forest, sometimes associated with the sun, sometimes with tears of gods or resin of sacred trees. To the Greeks, it became the tears of the Heliades, sisters of Phaethon who wept for their brother after he crashed the sun chariot. Their tears hardened into amber along the mythical Eridanus. To the Romans, it was both a luxury, and a scientific curiosity. Pliny noted its electrostatic properties and its ability to preserve insects. He also recorded its medical uses. Powdered amber mixed with honey for throat ailments, amber amulets against witchcraft. In later centuries, the same material would be carved into Christian rosaries and Islamic prayer beads. The road itself would shift and fragment under the pressures of migration, empire, and new trade systems. But the memory of the route remained. Medieval maps still marked the way north for amber. The Teutonic Knights later controlled the Prussian amber coast with an almost religious intensity, treating the resource as a strategic monopoly. But that is a later chapter. The deeper story is older. It is the story of how a fossil resin became a currency of connection across a continent that had no single language, no single power, and no written contracts that have survived. Trust, reputation, and the simple desire for the beautiful and the rare kept the amber moving. Walk the route in the mind. Start on a Baltic beach at dawn. The water is cold even in summer. Pieces of amber lie among the seaweed and driftwood after a storm. A gatherer picks them up, tests them by biting or by the smell of the smoke when a small piece is burned. The good pieces go into a leather bag. Days later, the bag is on a river boat. Weeks later, it is in a hill fort in what is now Poland or Slovakia. Months later, some of those same pieces are in a Celtic workshop in Bohemia, being polished and drilled. A year later, a finished necklace may hang around the neck of a woman buried near the Danube. Another piece continues south, reaches the Adriatic, crosses by ship to Italy or Greece, and ends its journey in a tomb or a temple treasury. Every stage is a human decision. Someone chooses to trade rather than keep. Someone decides the risk of the next leg is worth the profit. Someone accepts the amber as payment for food, protection, or passage. The road is not an abstraction. It is thousands of such decisions repeated across generations. And it worked. For centuries, the Amber Road carried more than amber. It carried the knowledge that the world was larger than any single valley or coastline. It taught the peoples of Europe that distant places existed and that their products could arrive. In that sense, it was a rehearsal for every later long-distance network. The Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade, the Atlantic systems that would one day connect continents. The Amber Road did not require an empire to function. It required only desire, geography, and people willing to move things farther than they themselves would ever travel. That is why it matters. Long before Roman roads, before Mediterranean galleys became the measure of connection, a golden stone was already teaching Europe how to be a single, if loosely joined, world. The question that remains is not whether the road existed. The archaeology is clear. The question is what it felt like to live along it, to be the person who watched the amber leave and never knew where it finally rested, or the person who received it and never saw the sea that made it. That is the human scale of the Amber Road, and it is the scale we will follow as the story continues. The Baltic does not give up its amber easily. Storms are required. The resin that has slept for millions of years in blue earth layers along the coast is torn free only when the sea is violent. After a hard gale, the beaches of Samland, of the Curonian Spit, of the Polish shore, can be littered with it. In the right conditions, a single person can gather more in a morning than a distant market will see in a season. But the gathering is only the beginning. The communities that controlled the Amber Coast developed specialized knowledge. They learned to distinguish true Baltic succinate from other resins. They learned which colors commanded higher value: the clear honey yellow, the rare red, the cloudy white. They learned to work the material with flint and later with metal tools, drilling holes with remarkable precision for the technology of the time. Amber workshops appear in the archaeological record of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. At sites such as Juad Krante on the Curonian Spit, thousands of finished and unfinished pieces have been found, along with the waste from production. This was not casual collecting, it was industry. From these coastal centers, the amber moved inland along established paths. One major corridor followed the Vistula and its tributaries. Another used the Niemen. Farther west, the Oder system carried material toward the Elbe, and eventually the North Sea and the Alpine routes. The people of the north did not write. Their understanding of the wider world is preserved only in the objects they buried with their dead and the settlements they left behind. Yet the presence of southern metal in northern graves and northern amber in southern ones tells us that information traveled with the goods. Stories of distant seas and strange peoples must have moved along the same tracks. In the Bronze Age, the volume increased. The demand from the growing elites of Central Europe and the Mediterranean pulled more amber south. At the same time, the metal that returned north transformed northern society. Bronze swords, axes, and ornaments appear in increasing numbers. Social hierarchy becomes more visible in the burial record. The Amber Road was not merely an economic artery, it was a catalyst for social change. By the early Iron Age, the network was mature. Celtic communities in the middle of the continent sat astride the main routes and prospered. The famous amber of the Hallstatt period, great necklaces, discs, and carved figures, shows both the wealth that the trade generated and the artistic traditions that developed around the material. Then came the Romans. When Roman power reached the Danube and the Alps, the Amber Road became visible in written sources for the first time. The Romans did not create the route. They inherited it, organized it more tightly in places, and left us the descriptions that make the earlier silence speak. Pliny's account of the expedition under Nero is revealing. The Romans wanted amber for spectacle and for status. They were willing to send an official north to acquire it in quantity. The fact that the journey was possible and that the local peoples were prepared to trade shows that the network was already in place and functioning. The same network would later supply the Roman provinces with amber jewelry, amulets, and even furniture inlaid with the material. In the northern provinces of the empire, amber continued to hold special meaning. It was both a local product and a link to the wider Roman world. Yet the deeper continuity remains the most striking. The Amber Road did not begin with Rome and did not end with Rome's decline. It was a prehistoric achievement that classical civilization encountered and partially absorbed. In that sense, it stands as a reminder that the history of connection in Europe is older than the histories written by the Mediterranean powers. The stone that burns had already been moving for centuries when the first Roman surveyed the route. And the people who started it, moving, never needed an empire to tell them that the world was large. They already knew. Transition. The amber that left the Baltic did not travel alone. In the same centuries that the northern resin was moving south through Europe, another set of routes was carrying different goods across a different sea. Far to the southeast, in the waters between Arabia, India, and the African coast, Arab and Persian sailors were already masters of monsoon and star. Their story is not separate from the larger pattern of early long-distance connection. It is the southern and eastern counterpart to the Amber Road, another proof that the world was linked by human movement long before the European age of oceanic exploration. The same human restlessness that sent amber across a continent sent ships across the Indian Ocean. And those ships, and the men who sailed them, form the next chapter of the older connected world. Arab and Persian travelers in the Indian Ocean. Before the European age of exploration, the Indian Ocean does not wait for permission. Its winds reverse with the seasons. The northeast monsoon of winter drives ships southwest. The southwest monsoon of summer drives them northeast. For anyone who learns to read those winds, the ocean becomes a highway rather than a barrier. Long before Portuguese caravels rounded the Cape, long before European maps marked the monsoon routes as discoveries, Arab and Persian sailors had already made the Indian Ocean their own. They did not discover it, they inhabited it. From the ports of the Persian Gulf, Suraf, Hormuz, later Basra, and from the southern Arabian ports of Aden and the Hadramaut, ships set out with the monsoon. They carried frankincense, myrrh, horses, metalwork, and later the products of the Islamic world. They returned with spices, textiles, precious stones, timber, and the knowledge of distant coasts. The vessels themselves were remarkable. The dhow, with its lateen sail and sewn rather than nailed planks in the earlier periods, was adapted to the conditions of the ocean. It could run before the monsoon and, with skill, work against it when necessary. Navigation relied on the stars, on the color of the water, on the presence of birds and floating debris, and on a deep traditional knowledge passed from master to apprentice. Persian and Arab geographers and travelers left written records that European exploration would later treat as exotic reports, rather than the products of a mature maritime culture. Ibn Khaldun in the 9th century already described the routes to India and China. The anonymous author of the Akhbar al-Sin Walhind recorded the experiences of merchants who reached Guangzhou. Suleiman, the merchant's account, preserved and expanded by later writers, speaks of the sea journey with the practical detail of a man who has made it. In the 10th century, the great port of Suraf on the Iranian coast was a hinge of the trade. Ships from there reached the Malabar coast, Sri Lanka, and beyond. The ruins of Suraf still show the wealth that the ocean trade produced: houses of stone, evidence of long-distance goods, a cosmopolitan population. The travelers themselves were not only merchants. Some were scholars, some adventurers, some men driven by faith or curiosity. The most famous of all, Ibn Battuta, belongs to a slightly later period, yet he moved through a world that earlier generations had already opened. In the 14th century, he could travel from Morocco to the Maldives, to India, to China, largely by sea and largely within networks that Arab and Persian sailors had sustained for centuries. But the deeper history is earlier. By the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Indian Ocean trade was already an integrated system. Persian Gulf ports linked to the Red Sea. The Red Sea linked to Egypt and the Mediterranean. From the Mediterranean, goods could move north and west. In the other direction, the same networks reached the East African coast, the land of the Zhang, where coastal towns would later grow into the Swahili city-states, themselves deeply influenced by Arab and Persian settlement and intermarriage. The monsoon was the engine. A ship leaving the Gulf in late autumn or early winter could ride the northeast monsoon to India. After trading, it could wait for the southwest monsoon to return. The rhythm was annual, predictable, and demanding. Timing was everything. A ship that missed the monsoon might wait months. A captain who misread the signs risked wreck on coasts that offered little mercy. Yet the system worked with remarkable consistency. Chinese sources record the arrival of ships from the west. Indian sources speak of the Yavana, a term that came to include Westerners arriving by sea. The presence of Persian and Arab communities in the ports of Western India is attested both archaeologically and in texts. In some places, they built mosques. In others, they integrated into local trading castes. The ocean did not erase difference, but it made difference ordinary. One of the most striking features of this world is how little it depended on political empire. The Abbasid Caliphate provided a cultural and economic framework, but the actual sailing and trading were often in the hands of private merchants and shipowners. Local rulers in India and East Africa participated because the trade was profitable. The network was resilient precisely because it was not a single state enterprise. When one port declined, another rose. When political conditions changed in the Gulf, the Red Sea routes adjusted. This is the world that the Portuguese entered at the end of the 15th century. They did not sail into an empty ocean. They sailed into a functioning commercial system with established routes, experienced pilots, and ports that already knew the value of long-distance exchange. The famous pilot who guided Vasco da Gama from Malindi to Calicut was part of that older system. The charts and sailing directions that European navigators later collected were often translations or adaptations of knowledge that Arab and Persian sailors had refined over generations. To speak of the age of discovery without this background is to mistake the European entry into the Indian Ocean for the beginning of the ocean's history. The ocean had already been crossed and recrossed. Its winds had already been named and used. Its ports had already grown rich on the movement of goods and people. The Arab and Persian travelers of the centuries before 1500 were not precursors waiting for Europe to arrive. They were participants in a mature maritime civilization that linked 3 continents through the regular pulse of the monsoon. Their ships carried more than cargo. They carried languages, religions, technologies, and stories. The spread of Islam along the East African coast and into parts of Southeast Asia followed the same routes as the spice trade. The architectural styles, the loan words, the family genealogies that still connect the Gulf to Gujarat and to Zanzibar are the living residue of that earlier movement. In the end, the Amber Road and the Indian Ocean networks belong to the same larger truth. Long before the modern era defined itself by oceanic empires and global maps, human beings had already found ways to cross great distances. They used rivers and mountain passes for amber. They used the reversing winds of the monsoon for spices, incense, and knowledge. In both cases, the driving force was the same: the recognition that somewhere else there existed something worth the risk of going. The sunstone of the Baltic and the pepper of Malabar traveled by different means, yet both moved because people refused to accept that the horizon was a limit. That refusal is the oldest engine of history, and it was already running, steadily and without fanfare. While the classical Mediterranean still believed it stood at the center of the world. You're standing there in the middle of nowhere, dust kicking up around your boots, the wind howling like it's got a personal grudge against you, and you're thinking, man, what the heck am I doing out here? That's the vibe we're diving into today, Because we're talking about two absolute legends who basically looked at the edge of the known world and said, "Yeah, I'm gonna go poke it with a stick." One guy from ancient China who accidentally kicked open the door to the whole Silk Road thing, and another from way over in the Greek colony of Massalia who sailed so far north that people back home thought he was making the whole story up. Zhang, Qian, and Pytheas of Massalia. These two didn't just travel. They connected worlds. Knowledge, goods, cultures, all that good stuff flowing back and forth like some ancient version of a group chat that never ends. Hey friends, if you're new around here, welcome. This is the spot where we sit down like old buddies and just chew on the wild stories from history that make you go, wait, that actually happened. No stuffy lectures, just straight-up storytelling. Today we're rolling with Zhang Qian's crazy 13-year odyssey that linked China to the west, and then swinging over to Pytheas and his northern adventure that dropped astronomy, tides, and geography bombs on the Mediterranean world. It's gonna flow, so stick with me. Grab a drink or whatever, because this one's a ride. All right, picture this. China, around 138 BCE. Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty is sitting there looking at the map. Well, whatever they had for maps back then. And the Qian are just wrecking shop on the northern borders. These nomadic warriors are tough, mobile, and constantly raiding. The emperor's like, we need allies. Who hates these guys as much as we do? Word is the Yuezhi people got pushed west by the Qian years earlier and might be itching for payback. So he picks this guy Zhang Qian, a court attendant, solid, reliable type, and says, take 100 men, go find the Yuezhi, make a deal. Zhang's like, bet. And off they go from Chang'an, heading west into what was basically the unknown. But friends, it goes sideways almost immediately. They're trying to slip through Qian territory all quiet-like, and boom, captured. Just like that. 10 years. 10 whole years held by the Qian. Zhang Qian gets married to a local woman, has a kid, settles in as much as a prisoner can. You ever been stuck somewhere way longer than you planned? Like that one relative's house during a holiday that somehow turns into a whole season. Multiply that by a decade and throw in the constant risk of never getting home. Most people would have folded. Not Zhang. He keeps the mission alive in his head the whole time. Then one day, opportunity hits. He and his guide Ganfu, also called Tangi Fu in some tellings, make a break for it. They slip away and keep pushing west. They hit Dayuan, that's the Fergana Valley area, modern Uzbekistan vibes. The people there are like, whoa, Chinese envoy, cool. They help him along to Kangju, then finally to the Yuezhi. Zhang delivers the pitch, hey, let's team up and smash the Qian together. And the Yuezhi are just not interested. They're settled now, living good in what's basically northern Afghanistan territory, fat and happy, no desire to go fight old enemies. Mission failed, right? Except Zhang doesn't just turn around. He hangs out, looks around, takes notes like a total pro. He sees the markets in Bactria, Daxia they called it, bustling with goods, remnants of those old Greek kingdoms left over from Alexander's time. He hears about even farther places, Parthia, India, all that. Horses that are legendary. Plants nobody in China has seen. Grapes, alfalfa, the works. Then he starts the long way home, trying to dodge the Qian by going south along the Kunlun Mountains. And wouldn't you know it, captured again. Another year stuck. But then the Qian have their own internal drama. The old leader dies, chaos erupts, and Zhang seizes the moment. He escapes with Ganfu and finally, after 13 years total, rolls back into Chang'an in 126 or 125 BCE. Out of the original 100+ guys, just these two make it. Emperor Wu is stunned. Zhang didn't bring the alliance, but he brought something way bigger, hard intel on the Western regions. 36 states, customs, products, geography. Suddenly China's eyes are wide open. Those heavenly horses from Fergana, the emperor wants them bad for the cavalry. New crops start coming in. Diplomatic feelers go out, trade routes start solidifying. Friends, this is the spark that turns into the Silk Road. Not one single road, more like a whole network of paths, but Zhang's journey made the Han court realize, hey, there's a whole world out there worth connecting with. You know what I think when I hear this part? Zhang Qian was supposed to be a diplomat with a military goal, but he ended up as this accidental explorer scholar. If it was you stuck for 10 years, would you still push forward once you escaped, or just book it home as fast as possible? Be honest in the comments later, because that persistence is wild. He didn't just survive, he observed everything. And later he goes out again around 119 BCE with a bigger group to link up with the Wusun people, sends assistants further out to places like Bactria and Sogdiana. He dies around 114 BCE, but the doors he cracked open stay open. Goods start flowing, silk going west, horses and ideas coming east, cultures mixing, knowledge exchanging, sustainable connections, like the prompt said, not a one-time raid, but ongoing links that last centuries. Now jump across the map and back a couple hundred years earlier, friends. Different corner of the world, same restless spirit. Massalia, modern Marseille, Greek colony on the southern coast of Gaul. Bustling trade hub. Pytheas is this navigator, astronomer, geographer type. Around 325 BCE or so, exact year is a bit fuzzy. Scholars debate the precise timing. He decides the Mediterranean isn't enough. He wants the north, the Atlantic, Britain, maybe beyond. So he sets out. Some say he sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, past the Carthaginians who controlled it. Others think he went overland through Gaul and hopped on local boats. Either way, he's heading into waters most Greeks only heard about in rumors. He hits Gads, that's Cadiz in Spain, then works up the European coast. Brittany, then across to Britain. Land's End in Cornwall, Belerium they called it, where the famous tin mines are. Tin was huge for bronze, so this is valuable intel. Pytheas claims he explored a big chunk of Britain on foot. He estimates the island's circumference at about 4,000 miles. Pretty solid for the time. He notes the people, their drinks made from grain and honey, how they thresh grain indoors because of the weather, stuff that screams, I was actually there. Not just making it up by the fire. Days get longer as he goes north. He measures latitudes with a gnomon, that shadow stick tool. At Massalia, he'd already nailed the latitude pretty accurately. Now he's applying it farther out. Then the big one. 6 days sail north from the tip of Britain, he reaches this place called Thule. Midnight sun. The sun barely sets in summer, polar conditions, ice. He talks about a sea that looks like a marine lung, maybe that mix of ice, water, and fog that makes sailing impossible. Friends, this is the first solid Mediterranean account of Arctic phenomena. But here's the thing, where exactly was Thule, Iceland, Norway, Shetlands? The debate is still alive. Ancient writers like Strabo called Pytheas a straight-up liar, said nobody could go that far. Polybius was skeptical too. Modern folks mostly believe he made the trip, but the exact spot of Thule is still theory territory, no hard consensus. Data on this part is incomplete and argued over, so take the precise location as unsettled. Pytheas also clocks the tides. In the Mediterranean, tides are mild. Up north, especially around Britain, they can be massive. He links them to the moon, first guy on record to really connect the phases of the moon to the rise and fall of the water. Pliny later quotes him saying tides in Britain rise crazy high, like 80 cubits, which is probably exaggerated or maybe referring to a storm surge, but the core idea sticks. He brings back geography of the northern coasts, maybe amber sources, descriptions of Germanic tribes. His book on the ocean is lost now, so we only get pieces through later writers. Some of them trash him, others use his numbers. But the knowledge lands in the Mediterranean world, better sense of how far north the lands go, astronomical observations, tidal theory. Suddenly, the edge of the world has shape. All right, pause for a second, friends. You ever notice how these explorers both started with practical goals, alliance for Zhang, trade, or curiosity for Pytheas, and ended up delivering way more than planned? Zhang opens the east-west pipeline. Pytheas fills in the north for the Greeks. Different directions, same energy. If you were Pytheas and people back home were calling you a liar for describing the midnight sun, would you still write it down or keep quiet? That skepticism from Strabo and crew is real, and it shows how hard it was to expand the mental map of the world. Some of Pytheas's details got twisted or doubted for centuries, but the core contributions held up. And the exchange part hits hard. For Zhang Qian, it's not just horses and grapes coming into China. It's the idea that there are sophisticated states out west with their own wealth and culture. Hellenistic leftovers in Bactria meeting Han ambitions. Silk starting its long journey toward Rome eventually. Ideas, technologies, even religions later on. Sustainable because once the roots are known and protected, Han sets up commanderies, fights the Qian more effectively with the new intel, traders keep coming. For Pytheas, it's knowledge flowing south, better navigation, understanding of climates, the fact that the world doesn't just end in a wall of ice or myth. Mediterranean thinkers get real data to chew on. These guys weren't superheroes with magic ships or infinite supplies. Zhang lost almost his entire party. Pytheas sailed into unknown storms and ice. Both dealt with skepticism or outright failure of the original mission. Yet the ripple effects last. Silk Road becomes this massive exchange network for over 1,000 years. Pytheas's observations feed into later geography and astronomy. Friends, that's the real juice, ordinary determination turning into world-changing connections. So what's the takeaway here? Curiosity plus grit equals expanded horizons. Zhang Qian didn't set out to open the Silk Road. He was just trying to get an alliance and came home with a whole new map of possibilities. Pytheas didn't plan to invent tidal theory. He observed and reported. And yeah, some of the northern details stay fuzzy. Thewel's exact ID is still argued. Some of the tide heights sound overstated, but the spirit holds.